The Anglo-Saxons. You know 'em, you love 'em. Through the early Middle Ages, these seafaring Saxons soared their way from Germania and onto the Albionic Isle, and sowed the seeds for what would become today's England. Or so the story goes. What's often not discussed is the guys that were there before them. Yeah, sure, there were the Romans before them, and the Celts before them, and the Cheddar Man before them, and this thing before them, but there was an easy 100 years between the Romans leaving and the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom sprouting, where neither of those famed groups had any notable presence. The people that lived during this time had just as much culture and were just as civilized as those before them. In fact, I'd be inclined to say that the average person knows more about these people than they think. That stretch of time is what I will be covering in this installment of England in Beta, a series where I cover all the major players in the formation of this funny little kingdom that I call home. Yeah, that's right, baby. After 400 years of Roman rule, the Celts are back in action. Well, the Celts didn't actually go anywhere. They just lived under the rule of the Romans. However, in the mid-5th century AD, the Roman government informed those living in the cities, those generally more Latinized than those in the country, that they would need to provide their own defences from now on, as Rome had business elsewhere with the Huns. As such, those outside the cities were now free to do their own thing. And of course, by doing their own thing, I mean that there was now a pretty big power vacuum that needed to be filled. Subsequently, every noble, soldier, and farmer with any prestige or prowess took up arms and declared their own fiefdom. As time went by, these fiefdoms grew and grew until some of them grew to about the same size as the US state of Connecticut. Unfortunately, the withdrawal of the Romans led to literacy almost completely dying out within a generation outside of the big cities. As such, most of what we know about these fiefdoms is what they called themselves and where they were located. If you know some of the history of the area, or are an extended timeline enjoyer like myself, then some of the fiefdoms that you might have heard of are Dumnonia, a precursor to modern-day Devon, Gwynedd, a fiefdom tucked away in the north of modern-day Wales, we'll talk about them later, Elmet, a small wooded fiefdom that those of you who watched the Leeds video will know about, Ibrauch, a successor state to the Roman city of Eboracum, and Strathclyde, a Welsh fiefdom in Scotland and the precursor to modern-day Cumbria. Despite having very little writing to call their own, these Brythonic kingdoms had rich cultural traditions, mostly manifesting in their own form of Christianity, referred to as Celtic or Insular Christianity. Celtic Christianity was culturally disconnected from the wider Christian world at the time, seeing more spirituality and closeness to God in a local woodland than any churchyard in Lazio. With the coming of the Anglo-Saxons and the general widening relations with the rest of the Christian world, the insular faith would eventually come to decline in Britain in the coming centuries, but would live on for a few centuries more in the neighbouring isles, mainly Ireland. About 5 seconds after the Romans left, many of these fiefdoms began to see invasions from the Picts, another Brythonic ethnic group from modern-day Scotland. These Picts never softened up under the rule of the Romans like the Britons did, and kept their traditional martial culture. Unfortunately for the folks in the lowlands, these Picts didn't want to join or take over their society. They just wanted to take their stuff. As such, many Brythonic fiefdoms began to employ Germanic mercenaries, many of which had already been living in Britain, having been brought over by the Romans as guards. These mercenaries were generally from areas like Saxony, Jutland, and what we would now call Schleswig-Holstein, areas where, like the Picts, the warrior culture was a lot stronger than that of Britain. This enticed many more warriors from the continent to come to Britain. It's likely that the legend of Hengist and Horsa was simply a literary paraphrasing of this migration. However, no one's exactly sure when this took place. There's a whole bunch of dates that get thrown around by various sources. This ruler that I got as a kid in York says 450 on it, so that date's good enough. Unfortunately, much of what we know about the Brythonic resistance to the invasion has been lost to speculation. The only proper sources are from people who lived hundreds of years after the period, and half the time they seem to try and blend it into the story of King Arthur. And don't even get me started on Geoffrey of Monmouth writing a literal fan fiction. I gotta talk about this. Of course, it's almost impossible to talk about the cultural legacy of the medieval Britons without mentioning Arthurian legend. Despite being mostly written centuries after the Anglo-Saxon invasion, tales of King Arthur, the Round Table, and everything else made up by this guy remain a quintessential part of Brythonic history and culture and can be seen as just as important to medieval Brythonic canon as Beowulf is to medieval England. As the decades went by, more and more land was lost to these Germanic warriors who would soon start to refer to themselves as Anglo-Saxons. It was said by the Strathclydian monk Gildas that once the Anglo-Saxons landed, it took just 44 years and 1 month to push the Britons back all the way to an area that the Romans called Cambria. As the front line began to stabilise, the Anglo-Saxons would give this land a different name. Its people, as native as they may have been, were foreign to the Germanic invaders. As such, that's what they called it, foreigners, or as they would know it in their own tongue, Wheelas.